Welcome back to the Treeline Pursuits channel. I hope that you'll consider subscribing to our channel and following us on Instagram. Today, we're going to continue on with our segment that we're calling Mastering the Art of Digital Scouting. In today's segment, we'll start to zero in on locating and finding those spots that tend to hold elk. Due to the amount of information that we're going to try to present in the Finding Elk segment, we're going to break this segment up into multiple videos. Video number one that we're going to do today, we're going to talk about some concepts and the basic principles around finding elk. Number two, we're going to talk about meadows, creeks, canyons, and drainages and how those relate. In part three, we're going to talk about fire zones, logging areas, sparse timber, and beetle kill areas. In installment number four, we're going to dive into slopes, benches, funnels, and saddles, and kind of how those relate to the movements of elk. And in our last video, number five, we're going to talk about water sources and wallows. It's often said that the hardest part of elk hunting is simply finding the elk. I hear that all the time, and I realize that's a pretty simplistic statement, but it's a pretty true statement. You just can't kill elk that aren't there. You'll also hear all the time that 10 to 20% of the elk hunters kill 80 to 90% of the elk. You know, once you spend some time elk hunting, you'll start to relate with that statement, I think. You know, the question that I have is, why does a relatively small group of hunters kill and find elk every year? And I think that you'll find, if you interviewed and talk with those hunters, that most of them, if not all of them, employ some of the tactics, if not many of the tactics that we're going to talk about during this entire scouting series. You know, unfortunately, when many elk hunters enter the field and they're starting their hunts, they're spending the first few days, and in some cases the entire hunt, looking for elk. They have a plan on a place they want to go, but they have not really taken the time to break that area down and strategically figured out how they're going to assault or work through that area. My goal with this series, and in particular this Finding Elk segment, is to give you some tips and some tactics that can help you reduce the amount of time it takes to find elk once you're in the field, to give you a strategy so that when you get on your hunt, you've got some tools in your toolbox. You've already got some places that you want to visit. You've already looked at trends and patterns, and it'll help you be productive and efficient in the ways that you go around finding elk when you actually get on your hunts. I talked about this in previous videos, but I think it's important that I give you at least a basic background on myself and kind of how I started Treeline Pursuits. I've been chasing elk now for about 25 years. My goal each year, each season, is to have somewhere between 2 to 4 elk tags in my pocket, and I tend to like to hunt between 2 to 3 states each year. You know, 3 years ago, I moved from Missouri to Montana, so I have a lot of experience in traveling from the east to west to hunt elk, and I really understand the challenges that go along with that. So a lot of this series is really angled that way. A lot of the principles that I cover in the series, of course, can be used by anyone, whether they're living out west or traveling from the east to west. But when I first started elk hunting, I would have killed for resources like we have today. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go along. But the amount of information that we have available to us today is just fantastic. The apps and the tools that we'll talk about, all of those things have just really come along and really have helped to elevate us as elk hunters. It's almost an unfair advantage for the elk nowadays. I live in Missoula, Montana right now, and Treeline Pursuits is 100% dedicated to supporting that public land do-it-yourself hunter. Personally, I love elk hunting. I hunt a lot of other big game animals, but elk hunting is really my passion. I spend the majority of my 100 days in the field each year chasing elk. I wanted to briefly tell you what this series on scouting is not. I've mentioned this before, but I think that it's important that I make this very clear. It is not a promotion for a certain product, an app, or a website, or a tool. It's just plain and simple the exact set of resources that I use in my personal pursuits of elk hunting. You know, we love to be in the backcountry and we love to spend time there, but ultimately our number one goal is harvesting an elk. But it surprises me how many guys just do not take the time to learn these new or these available technology tools. They just don't take the time to learn the details and the ins and outs. They learn the basics. They learn how to, how to use them on a surface level, and then they usually will leave it at that. Most of these apps, tools, and websites do a lot more things than most hunters are using them for. I think as we get started here, I think it's important also to talk about the time of year that you're going to be spending time elk hunting. You know, we're not going to spend a lot of time, on this topic, but obviously it's a vital part of elk hunting. And timing and scheduling your hunt is also something I get a lot of questions about. So I would highly recommend that you spend a few moments and go to gohunt.com. If you're a member of gohunt.com, if you're not, you should be. It's one of the best $149 I spend each year, and it's not a promotion for that site. I pay my own membership, and I gladly do it. But I do write a few articles for that site, and I wrote one article in particular on how to use the equinox and moon phase to plan your elk hunts. And it was written for 2018, but you can do the math and relate it to the equinox dates for this year. But I really think for guys that are coming out from east to west particularly, that are going to have to pick a 7 or 10 day hunt time frame, I think that article will be very useful for you to evaluate those dates if you have the flexibility for that. I realize sometimes it's just what you got, and it's elk hunting on any days is better than not elk hunting. But I'll post a link in the description below on this video so that you can reference that article. You know, how to find elk is the number one question that I get. I get that question on my YouTube comments. I get it on my comments on Instagram. I get personal emails. I get instant messages. And most of those questions are related to how I personally go about finding elk. You know, like I said before, I don't always find elk. I don't think any hunter always finds elk. But what you'll hear me say this over and over again, I'm trying to turn the strategy of finding elk into an odds game. What I mean by that is I want to stack as many odds in my favor as possible. I don't want to rely on one tip. I don't want to rely on one strategy or one tactic. I want to use multiple strategies and tactics so that I can increase my odds. And it's that simple. That's my goal when I'm trying to locate and find places that elk will want to be, is I'm playing the odds game. You know, there's a lot of information out there about finding elk and strategies other guys use, and it's all good information. But what I find generally is they spend a lot of time talking in platitudes. You know, and what I mean is you'll read all the time, avoid the roads, stay away from the roads, of course. You get in shape, get in the best shape you can for elk hunting, or don't bother coming. Well, I agree with getting in shape, but I don't agree with don't bother coming. Stay out all day. You know, don't go back to camp during the day. I absolutely agree with that. Hunt hard, don't ever give up. You know, of course that's true. Those are all qualities and traits of successful elk hunters. But with all those statements being true, you can still end up with an unpunched elk tag. You know, just because you do all of those things does not mean you're going to put yourself in a place that has elk or that there's elk available in that area. When I'm elk hunting or when I'm planning my elk hunts, when I'm sitting down in my office doing my digital scouting, and when I'm in the field, I basically use 4 tools. I obviously use Google Earth. I'm still a big fan of Google Earth for a lot of reasons that I'll talk about in this video series. I use Gaia probably as my primary hunting application, Gaia GPS. I use Onyx on every hunt. There's a lot of features on Onyx that I absolutely love, and I have both tools available with me all the time. I also use CalTopo quite a bit in my digital scouting. I'll mention this very briefly, but I'll cover this more when I get into the video that I'm going to call Tools of the Trade. But Top Rut is another one of my favorite websites here lately. I just joined as a member for Top Rut. One of the features that Top Rut has is a download feature. It's just incredible, and we're going to talk about this in great detail later on, but you can download a KML file for Google Earth that has all kinds of layers. You can download an entire hunting district at once, and it has all the layers built into it. So if you haven't used toprut.com and that KML layer tool, I highly recommend you do that too. Before we can start really digging into the finding elk techniques, I think that we have to cover a few concepts that are centered around finding elk, and that's really the purpose of this first video. The first one I want to kind of cover is knowing your limitations. This is really important in digital scouting. It makes no sense to do all of this digital scouting work and set this computer and do all these waypoints and export this data and put them into your hunting apps and get your hunt plan together and all your hunt areas written out if you can't physically get into those areas. And in particularly, if you can't get an elk out of those areas, you have to be completely honest with yourself when you're setting down doing your digital scouting. Otherwise, your hunt's just going to become a train wreck. And I've seen so many, it's so easy to get carried away with Google Earth and these apps online. You got this ridge over here, you got this drainage over here, you've got this burn back here. And it's just so easy to get wrapped up in those. And you draw a line and the line looks like it's 5 miles, but when you get there and you start doing the ups and downs, it's 7 or 8 miles. You know, those things are all factors that you've got to take into consideration when you're doing your digital scouting. If you're sitting at that desk, that mountain ridge over there looks pretty easy on your flat two-dimensional screen. So just keep that in mind and make sure that the time you spend setting up these hunting areas, that you are really keeping that in mind and really understanding your limitations. You know, I'm going to give you an example. So let's say we've got two guys hunting together. They're on foot. They're backpack hunting. They've got a 60 to 70 pound pack for, let's call it 5-6 days of hunting. It's archery season. It's early or mid September. And they're going to pack in for 5 miles to a hunt area. Well, if they kill an elk back there and it's a mature bull of any size, they could be facing 30 miles of packing. And I know most of you have probably already calculated that, but most mature elk with 2 guys is going to take 2 trips. Can you do it in one? Absolutely. Can you do it in one with your camp? I don't know many guys that can do it. Has it been done? Probably. 30 miles of packing with half of that being under pretty heavy weight. It has to be considered when you're working up your hunt strategy. So this article I wrote was also on gohunt.com. And it's available on that website. It's called Solo Hunting. It's the art of solo hunting. And in that article, I talk a lot about personal limitations, fears, other things that really relate to not only when you're hunting solo, but just elk hunting in general. I think it would be remiss if we didn't talk a few minutes about the basic needs of elk. This is beat to death by almost every video, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's pretty darn obvious. But there are some things I think that I can add to that. Food, water, security. Now, I group security up with bedding and sanctuary. So when you're talking about the 3 basic needs, I usually talk about food, water, and then bedding, sanctuary, and security. You know, when you talk about the feed and what elk what they prefer to feed on, the grasses and the sedges are what they're primarily focused on during your hunting seasons. When you talk about security, you have to understand that security plays different roles at different times of the year. During the summer months, security means it is a whole different meaning to an elk versus opening day of rifle season or even a week into rifle season. So when you're looking at security, you got to kind of analyze what time of year you're hunting and just the overall pressure into the area. You know, the breeding season, it doesn't mean they're not going or they're going to ignore one of those needs, because they're not. They just might use them differently, and they might use them in non-shooting times. We spent a lot of time in segment 1 and even in segment 2 talking about zones of pressure. It's that important to finding out. You know, in a lot of cases, you can use pressured areas to your benefit. Just because an area has a I don't want to say overwhelming amount of pressure because the elk are not going to tolerate that. But just because an area has a significant amount of pressure does not mean the elk are going to move out of that area. In some cases, I know this is going to sound bizarre, but in some cases, areas that have a lot of roads and interconnected travel corridors are easier to hunt and pinpoint elk than the vast remote reaches of wilderness areas. And the reason I say that is these units or these areas, and I've hunted them several times, that have a lot of roads, they tend to concentrate elk in very identifiable locations. It's pretty easy to map out the road structure as I talk about in segment 1 with your trailhead radiuses and the radiuses around all of the roads, and it'll be real eye-opening as these hot spots or these more secluded, I wouldn't call them secluded, but more secluded spots tend to jump out at you. So just because your hunting area or your hunting district has a lot of roads does not mean that it's going to be difficult to find elk. Now, to me, I prefer to hunt more remote areas. I like that for a number of reasons. Number one, the quality of the hunt. I just love being in the backcountry. I like the remoteness of the backcountry. I like the solitude of hunting elk. I spend about 50% of my hunting time solo. So that's what floats my boat. I like that. I think that the more remote you are, the more comfortable elk are moving around in shooting hours. I think in the example I gave before with the roads, you're going to have to play that game. I love to call elk. I mean, it's one of my favorite things. And, elk tend to be more callable and more manageable in remote areas. Again, just because they've been called to a lot, it doesn't mean they're not going to bugle. It doesn't mean they're going to be silent necessarily. I just find that they're easier to deal with and not quite as call shy, obviously, in the more remote areas. I think the stability of the elk is better in the more remote reaches. And what I mean by that is I think in the example before that I gave, the elk tend to move around a little bit more in pressured areas. They may not stay put in an area for a longer period of time. I think that when you're presented with an opportunity to harvest an elk in a higher pressure area, you have to take that opportunity when it's presented to you. I think that in the more remote or less pressured areas, I think you have opportunities to back out and come back, and the elk, you have a good chance of those elk still being in that or around that general area. I get asked this question all the time is, how far do I need to pack in, or do I need to look? When I do my scouting, how far do I need to pack in or look for elk? That's not an easy question to answer because of the hunt area. Is it a general area? Is it a limited draw area? How many hunters are in that area just in overall? So, barring all that, I want to give you some generalities, some guidelines that I kind of use when I'm looking at areas or I'm trying to identify, some key hunting spots. I think that 1 to 4 mile zone is pretty much dedicated to the day hunters and maybe the majority of the backpack hunters. I use that word majority a little loosely. There's more and more guys that are venturing deeper and deeper all the time. Backpack elk hunting is becoming very popular. So you're going to run into guys a little bit further back. But generally, I think of that 1 to 4 mile zone. Again, terrain, lots of factors here, but you're going to see mostly day hunters and probably the far majority of your backpack hunters in that zone. In that 5 to 8 mile zone, that's what I call the sweet spot, at least for me. That's a really great distance to get in and out in a day. It's a really great spot for me to use my pack llamas in that distance. It's pretty much dedicated to the very serious backpackers and or people that are using stock. But I have found that the outfitters and horse people, they tend to want to go further than that. That's not a hard, fast rule, but most outfitters and most guys that I run into are usually more than 8 miles back when it comes to that. I don't know if they feel like they're hunting yet, if they're on horses and they're stopping after 5 miles, but You have to be prepared to deal with an elk 5 to 8 miles back. If you're with a backpack, that is a serious proposition. And I know a lot of you guys that are already elk hunting, you already know that. I'm really saying that more for the guys that are new and they get a little over their head, or they can tend to get in over their head when they get back in places that are that far. I will also add to that, the further you go back, this is probably a good tip to remember. The further you pack in, the more important it is you get off trail. And what I mean by that is in that 1 to 4 mile zone, you'll find guys off trail quite a bit that are day hunting or light backpack hunting. Meaning that they can get off trail and they can get back to their base camps within a reasonable amount of time in the evenings and the mornings. But when you get that 5 mile range, particularly if you're trying to come from a base camp or a vehicle type of operation, you're trying to walk 5 miles a day into a hunting spot, I find those guys just do not get off the trail. We're going to talk about trails coming up, but they just tend to walk the trail and bugle, and then they run out of time and they got to walk all the way back. It's just, I see it over and over again. In that 5 to 8 mile zone, I just rarely see hunters off trail. So just keep that in mind. I think that's a good tip to remember, that off trail is really key in that zone. I mentioned this, the 8+ mile zone, I call it. That's really reserved for stock hunters. There's a few guys that can do it, but you really got to have your game on if you're going to consider hunting elk at 8 miles in my opinion. And there's plenty of guys do it. But if you're talking about early, mid archery season, it can become a dangerous proposition. Dangerous in regards to losing meat, and even putting yourself in a physical situation that could be overwhelming. Within reason, when you talk about pressure, within reason, I don't worry about hunters in an area. There's a reason they're there. If you're going to an area that in today's world of elk hunting, if you're going to an area that has absolutely no hunters, I'd be worried there's no elk. I mean, seriously. What I try to do when I'm in an area that has some pressure is I simply just try to position myself between them and the elk. I went to a unit in Colorado. It was an over-the-counter unit this year with a buddy of mine. It was his spot. He warned me ahead of time. He goes, "Now, Mark, don't get excited when we get to the trailhead and there's a lot of people there." And I'm thinking, when he says a lot of people, I'm thinking a couple of cars. We roll into this trailhead and there is nothing short of 75 rigs in this field. There was 4-wheelers, wall tents, trucks. It was crazy. People parked out on the roads, people setting their tents up in the road. I'm thinking to myself, I wasted 13 hours driving from Montana to come down here to Colorado. We're gonna be overwhelmed. But he assured me that we're going to pack in a little bit of a difficult pack out. It was about a 9 mile in. It was about a 3,000 to 4,000 foot elevation change. And it was in an area that had plenty of water. It was just hard to get to because it was about an 800 foot drop, between a 600 and 800 foot drop to get to the water. We got into this area and saw 2 hunters in 10 days. Of all those hunters at that trailhead, I really couldn't believe it. But we saw dozens and dozens of elk every single day. We didn't leave the area. We didn't change our plan. We had a strategy in advance. We had pre-scouted this. I had done multiple hunt areas. I went through all the techniques that we're talking about in this series. We had a plan and we worked it. And we went to our first hunting area and we spent 10 days. We may have ventured into hunt area number 2 a little bit from there. But for the most part, we spent the entire 10 days in hunt area 1. When you're talking about finding elk, you have to spend a few minutes talking about elevation and how those factors affect elk. The high country doesn't always translate into good elk hunting. That's another thing you hear all the time. Even a lot of the good hunters are saying it. Go high to kill elk. Now, don't get me wrong. I tend to want to focus on the higher areas, but it is not a rule. I've been in plenty of high alpine areas where the grass is just crazy dry and brittle and has already become brown by hunting season. And there's elk sign everywhere, but it's not fresh and it's not recent. They have been hanging out there in the summer. They were there when that grass was amazing and lush, and now they've moved down to more of a mid elevation. So high is great when the conditions are right. When it comes to elevation, I think that there's really two factors. It's pressure that can put them up high, and it's the food sources. Typically, as I said, I like to spend time high hunting for elk, but I will not focus high very long if the food is not viable in that area. Now, the bulls, particularly, they tend to want to be high in the summer for sure. There's a lot of reasons. Obviously, the food is at its prime after the runoff. Once the snow has melted and a few weeks go by, that grass is some of the best grasses that they're going to find all year, and they tend to concentrate on that grass at the higher elevation. So basically think of it as the winter time to summertime, they're moving up, and then in the hunting season, they're starting to move down for the winter. Now, they can be very subtle changes in elevation. When I say coming down, I don't mean 5,000 feet, a few hundred feet even, could make a radical change in how the food and the food sources are. But over the years, I found a lot of elk at that mid-elevation range. I think one of the reasons that most of my archery season is spent during the rut, and I think the cows are more likely to follow the food than even the bulls. The bulls will probably accept the high country maybe with a little bit more subpar food than maybe a little bit lower, just because they like it up there and the bugs don't bother them as much. It's cooler up there. It's more secure. It's more remote. And I think they tend to like and prefer that, especially during the summer months. But once that rut comes, those bulls are going to go to where those cows are. And those cows will absolutely follow the food source. So finding your best food sources is a real key. Once you get into an area, it's very important that when you're preparing your hunt plan and your hunt areas, that you account for a couple of different or variations in elevation. I've made this mistake several times. Unfortunately, I've repeated this mistake where I've really invested in a general area, and all of my micro hunt areas were all basically at the same elevation. And when I got into those areas, I found that, I've had two problems. One, the food source wasn't what I hoped it would be. And number two, we had severe weather. I've had cases where I've been September the 10th, September the 12th, and had 20 inches of snow. And it really didn't change the elk. I mean, it's not like the elk ran down the mountain when they had 20 inches of snow, but they did relocate. And that relocation caused a problem for me with my hunt plans. And I had to become more adaptive in the field. I like to have options already identified. That doesn't mean I will not deviate, as I mentioned in the prior video. Of course, I'll deviate from my hunt plans, but I like to have that strategy mapped out before I get into the field. And so when you are preparing your hunt plans and your hunt areas, make sure that you're accounting for some various or changes in elevation. Next, I want to talk about something that I don't hear a lot of guys talking about. And I'm not saying this is revolutionary or groundbreaking, but it's something I do that I do not hear very often. And I think it's an underutilized technique. It's how I evaluate how I'm going to move around in the area that I've identified, and even more importantly, how I evaluate the pressure in an area without boots on the ground or without being there. So what I like to do is I like to evaluate the trails. Hunters, I mentioned this before, they just do not like to get off the trail. So if I can find trails that are lightly used and get off of those lightly used trails, I know that I'm in a gold zone, or potentially a gold zone. Getting off trail, you're just going to find more elk. It's just that simple. These elk know where these trails are just like they know where the roads are, particularly these high trafficked trails, which is why I like to look at and really analyze this trail set. Getting off trail for most hunters, it's not comfortable. They don't like it. It requires navigation. They've got to be on their game. They've really got to understand how to use their GPSs or their apps or whatever they're using. They've got to understand it. Hopefully, they're going to be navigating that off trail in those prime times, which is the dark before dawn and well after dark after prime time is passed. And just a lot of guys are just not comfortable with that. I like to, when I'm looking at trails and I'm evaluating these trails, I'm using Google Earth and I'm also using these apps. I'm trying to estimate the trail usage. You can tell a lot about looking at an individual trail. Now, when I say trail, I mean a trail that is marked on a USGS topographic map, and you're looking at that trail for one, either accessing an area or for moving around within an area. So let's take a look at an example of how I would evaluate a trail and the pressure on that trail. Okay, in this particular example, we're going to look at a trail and we're going to do our best to estimate the usage or the pressure that this trail might receive during the year, or even particularly during hunting season. If we zoom out here in this particular, I just picked this random spot. You can see that we've got some spots over here marked that are surrounded by private property. And one of our ways into this area, into this whole region here, is potentially via this trail that is located right here. So this would be a case where we would want to look at this trail and to see how much usage this trail is getting. So when we look at this trail, we can see that this trail comes through the timber here, and we're entering an open park area, and then we're re-entering the timber here as the trail drops in elevation. And then from this particular point, we would have access to this hunting area off trail. So when I go about evaluating a trail, I'm looking for a couple of things. So in this particular case, we're on the Gaia GPS app. We're on the online version. This is what I use probably the majority in the field. I use both Gaia GPS and OnX in tandem when I'm on my elk hunts. So on this trail, we're going to zoom in here and we're going to switch our layers. And in Gaia, you just push the layers button and you've got access to all your layers that you've got installed. You can install multiples, but right now this is the set we have. And we're going to slide up the satellite with labels layer. And you can see right off the bat that the satellite with labels has a label for this trail. This is not a ground impression. This is just a label that is on this layer. It's very nice to have that as a reference. So you can see when we're taking Gaia into its maximum zoom level, which is here, we cannot really pick up this trail through this meadow. We can kind of scroll down here, and I just can't, at this zoom level with Gaia, I can't pick up this trail. And I can't pick it up much over here either in this open section. So at first you might think that if you only limited yourself to one tool, you would say, well, this trail is just non-existent, or it certainly isn't used. But I always like to reevaluate and get a second opinion. So my go-to resource for second opinion is to go directly to Google Earth Pro. So we're going to switch over to Google Earth Pro, and we're going to look at this same. There's our mark for our meadow. And you can see, lo and behold, at the Google Earth zoom level, you can see this trail right up here in the upper portions of this meadow. You can see that it comes down here. You can see that it travels along here, and then it re-enters the timber right here. You can see that I can make some assumptions by looking at this trail already. Number one, this trail is very lightly used at best. It certainly isn't, I wouldn't call it an overused trail. I am noticing that it looks like this gray timber, this is an indicator. I'd have to do some more investigation to make sure this wasn't some kind of strange patchy fire burn, but it looks to me like it's a beetle kill area, the way it's patchy. So that tells me that we could have some down timber on this trail. That could limit access to hunters as well into an area, and into a remote area. But here on Google Earth, you can see that we can pick up the trail, even though we could not see it on the Gaia level. So just to get one more look at it, Let's switch back and let's take a look at it in OnX. So in the OnX view, in the satellite view, I've got the layers turned on for trails. So you can see this Elk Park Trail 113 down here. But again, you can't pick the trail up until you can barely see it here. I wouldn't say this is as clear maybe as the Google Earth, but it's pretty darn close. But we can pick it up, and we can continue to pick it up as it re-enters and actually connects with itself again here as it goes through the meadow. I have found that trails through meadows on topographic maps are usually, they can be not way off, but they can be significantly off just because of over time people have changed their track through the meadows and etc. But we can pick up this trail. So in this particular case, if we're evaluating this trail into our hunting area, I would come to the conclusion that this is a pretty lightly used trail. It looks like it's in a beetle kill area. There could be some timber across the trail. And this looks like a pretty ideal trail for getting into a remote area that's not getting a lot of pressure. To take this evaluation one step further, let's take a look at where this trail, we're going to switch back to the topographic layer. And we're going to zoom out just ever so slightly here. And we're going to follow this trail down. So I've already kind of looked, and this trail intersects another trail. You can see that this trail, this is one of the reasons that I really like to use Gaia, to be totally honest with you. Gaia has this USGS topo layer, which shows the actual topographic description. This is what this area looks like on Gaia. This is what the same area looks like on OnX. And personally for me, this is the limitation for OnX. This is one of the reasons that I prefer to use Gaia in the field, is that this topographic view is just a little plain for me personally. Some people like the plainness of it. It makes it easier to deal with. Personally, I like to see the full topographic view with all of the features that come with topographic maps. Back to our trail analysis. So you can see the trail starts to drop in altitude here and connects up with this trail. There are some mines in this area. So this probably isn't a good example because I can already probably tell you, since I'm seeing mines, that I'm going to be able to predict what this trail is. So this is showing a trail. But let's switch over to our satellite. And most people might not go further than that. They would just take that for granted that that's a trail. So when we go to our aerial photo view and we start to zoom in, it's pretty clear right off the bat that this is not a trail. This is actually an old road of some kind that more than likely, like I said, ends up servicing that mine. At this point, I haven't done enough investigation to be able to tell if this road was open to vehicular traffic or not. But if I saw something like this very close to my hunting area, one, I would want to know that. Either I would use that road to access this trail, or I would have to be aware that other hunters could be doing that. So just because on the topographic layer it shows a trail, when we switch to the satellite, it's clear that it's not just a trail, and it would require further investigation. So that's pretty much how I evaluate trails and trail usage. Well, that brings us to the end of our Finding Elk segment, the concepts of finding elk. Next up, in part 2, we're going to talk about meadows, canyons, creeks, and drainages, and how those all relate to finding elk. Again, thanks for watching. I hope you'll follow us on Instagram and subscribe to our channel.